أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Brothers and sisters, welcome to another one of our Mizan live sessions. I pray that everyone is doing well, inshallah. As you know, we've been continuing with the discussion that we had started before, and that was pertaining to the rulings of the conditions of Salat or Muqaddamatus Salat. We are done with that discussion actually, and we have basically finished that discussion. And now we have reached the point where we're discussing the rulings that have to do with Salat itself. So as I've mentioned multiple times, I'll mention this again, that inshallah we won't be discussing all of the rulings of Salat. There's a lot of rulings in Salat, many of which we are already familiar with. While we're discussing the rulings of Salat, what we will be emphasizing two main issues, or two main type of content basically. First is the type of content or the type of rulings that usually we don't pay attention to. They're a little bit more detailed, a little bit, we might be a little less familiar with them. So that's the first type of content that we'll be emphasizing, or just going through a little bit more. And particularly when it comes to Salat now that we're discussing, we will be putting more time or some time at least into discussing the what is called commonly in scholarly circles as Asrarus Salat, which is like basically, well, if you wanted to go with a translation, an exact equivalent, you would use the word secrets. But you might call it maybe, for example, the philosophy behind each and every action that we perform in our Salat. A little bit of what every action is a symbol of and what is it supposed to symbolize basically. So that we will go through, particularly because we're discussing the rulings of Salat. There is quite a bit to discuss there as well, and hopefully that'll help to take the topic. And because rulings can be somewhat dry. I know some of the brothers who message me sometimes, they say that the rulings part can be a little dry. They do say that we've been able to make it as interesting as it can be, but hopefully this will help to bring a little bit of a new feel, as long as at least we're discussing Salat. Because when it comes to Salat, we have a lot of literature in that regard. Other acts of worship, we may not have that as much literature when it comes to like the secrets behind them and the symbols and what each action symbolizes and what it stands for basically. So that's an overview. Like we do every week, I'm going to go through a quick review of what we discussed in our last session, and after that we will move on to what we plan to discuss for today, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who has joined us. Very nice to have you guys with us, to the brothers and our dear sisters. So quick review of what we discussed in the previous session. We were finishing up and wrapping up the topic of ghusl. We said that when it comes to ghusl, Ayatollah Sistani, he says that when someone is doing ghusl, they actually don't really have to take into consideration the tartib, or the order between the right and the left side. He said once you wash the head and the neck, then you can wash the rest of the body in whichever order that you want. Ayatollah Khamenei, on the other hand, he said no, there's an order between them. You have to go for the right side first and then the left side. So that was with regards to that ruling. And we said that makes a difference, because if you mess up or you forget to wash a certain part of the body, if you follow Ayatollah Sistani, you don't have to go back into the shower and do a whole ghusl all over again. If it's on your body and not your head and your neck, basically you can just wash that part of your body, and that would be the end of your ghusl, because ghusl doesn't have what we call muwalat. Muwalat meaning that you do things without placing a gap between the different parts of wudu or ghusl or salat, right? So for ghusl, there is no muwalat. Therefore, if you wash the part of your body that you hadn't washed 2 days later, then your ghusl would be correct, as long as you haven't done anything in those 2 days that would normally require you to do ghusl again. So that's something to remember. Okay, so that was the first ruling. Moving on, we said if someone doesn't know, and I feel like this ruling is a ruling that a lot of people might be dealing with, or you might know people who are dealing with this ruling, or you might know a lot of people in the future who don't know about this ruling yet. In the future, they'll turn to you and say, oh, I was supposed to do ghusl, I didn't know this, like growing up, for example, right? So the question is, what do you have to make up for your prayers and for your fast if you didn't know that you were supposed to do ghusl? Obviously, if someone didn't do it on purpose, then obviously they have to make up for it. There's no doubt about that. But if I didn't know about the ruling, so we mentioned Ayatollah Sistani's ruling in this regard was that the fasts are correct. However, when it comes to the prayers is where things became a little bit more difficult. He said that yes, you have to make up for all of those salats, the fasting, if you had an excuse in terms of your your ignorance regarding this particular ruling, like you didn't know because it never even occurred to you to go and find out about it, then you would not have to make up for it. Otherwise, you would have to. But for salat, he says you have to make up for all of them. As far as I can remember, Ayatollah Khamenei also says the same thing. At least when it comes to prayer, he definitely says that you have to make up for all of it. So that's a little bit of bad news for people who may have not known about the ruling, like growing up and things of that nature. Okay, next ruling we mentioned is that if someone has long hair, do they have to wash all of their hair in the ghusl? We said no, that's not necessary. What you have to wash is actually the skin on the head. And we moved on to the conditions of ghusl. We said ghusl is very similar to wudu. There's just one or two different points that we have to point out here. Number one is that, as we mentioned, there's no mawalat in ghusl. You can do one part and then wait half an hour and do another part. And we explained how that plays a role practically in the way we do ghusl. We mentioned that in ghusl you can go up and down, whereas in wudu you can only go downwards. And also tayammum, if you remember before, we explained this before, that even in tayammum you're only supposed to go downwards. And also in ghusl you're supposed to get the water to the skin. So for those who have facial hair, and in wudu they say if you have facial hair and the skin isn't showing from beneath the facial hair, you just have to wash the facial hair. But in ghusl, no, you have to wash the skin. And all of this happens naturally. We don't want anyone obsessing over did the water get to my skin or not. That has to do with the Catheter Shock issue, which I will touch on. I've been touching on the past 3 or 4 sessions, and I'll touch on it again real quick. Okay. Then we asked, does my body need to be tahir before doing ghusl? There was a difference of opinion. Ayatollah Khamenei said yes. Ayatollah Sistani said no, as long as you're using tap water, and while you're doing the ghusl, you do tathir of that body part at the same time. Why is this important? I mean, no one goes into ghusl thinking, oh, let me keep like this blood on my hand. No, this is important because a lot of times after you do ghusl, you remember that, oh, like my hand had blood on it, I didn't wash it. Is my ghusl going to be correct or not? So for Ayatollah Sistani, it would be fine. For Ayatollah Khamenei, it would not be fine. It would be a problem. Can you do ghusl for multiple purposes? We mentioned that yes, if someone does something that requires them to do ghusl, if they've done that action multiple times, whatever it may be, then you can perform one ghusl instead of the 2 or 3 times that action was performed. And we also answered this question, can you do ghusl instead of wudu? We said Ayatollah Sistani and Ayatollah Khamenei, they have a stark difference of opinion here. Ayatollah Khamenei says only if it's a wajib ghusl, and Ayatollah Sistani says any wajib or mustahab ghusl. But it's important to remember that ghusl is not like wudu. So for wudu, you can just do wudu with the intention of taharat. Like there's no... In Islam, there's no particular timing that I would say this way, the recommendation to do wudu is not limited. Although for namaz it becomes wajib, right? But outside of namaz, it's always mustahab to just have wudu, even if you're not going to do anything with that wudu, right? But ghusl is not like that. So when it comes to ghusl, it doesn't have a general recommendation. It's only recommended for specific things. Now, for specific things, it becomes wajib. For other things, it might be mustahab. So Ayatollah Sistani says, if you're dealing with one of those situations where it's actually mustahab, specifically, then if you do the ghusl with that intention, you can use that ghusl for any wudu that you would normally want to do. So that's why we explained last week a little bit about this, and we said that basically the main ghusl that we would be dealing with that is mustahab and could practically replace the wudu that we would be doing is the ghusl of Friday. And we mentioned that if someone forgets to do it on Friday, they can do it on Saturday. We discussed that as well in the previous session. Okay, we went through some other rulings. I'm going to skip over some of these just because we had covered them in the previous session. The last one that I want to point out is the idea of Catheter Shock. I've mentioned this multiple times. You'll hear me mentioning it over and over again because I know that it's something that people deal with, and unfortunately a lot of times they don't get that guidance at the right time, and then it grows into a huge problem. So with Catheter Shock, we've mentioned this multiple times, that Catheter Shock means someone who is just naturally having more doubts than a normal person. That's the way you figure out if you're Catheter Shock or not. So if you feel like you fall under that category, then you really need to start paying attention, because this is a red flag. This can turn into snowball, I should say, into something that can make life very, very difficult, God forbid. Okay, and obviously once someone becomes Catheter Shock, they're having more doubts than normal people do, then obviously they're not supposed to pay attention to their doubts, and they should ignore them. One point that I mentioned, I don't know if for those who were watching the last session, we mentioned that there's another form of becoming Catheter Shock where, and I've seen this, where this person, he doesn't have too many doubts about how he's supposed to apply rulings to his day-to-day life, or whether it applied or not. Like in the sense of, did I wash my hand, or did I wash my face when I was doing the ghusl, or whatever the case may be. He starts having doubts and so many questions about the rulings, like in the sense of a normal person would live their life, would go to a gathering and come back, and maybe one question pops up, like, is this allowed or is this not allowed? This person, he goes to a gathering, he has like 20 different questions and 20 different about rulings, about whether such and such an action is okay, what if it's like this, what if it's like that. So if you do feel like it's like that, then you can always reach out to us, and we can hopefully provide a little bit of guidance there, because that is another form of being Catheter Shock. And I've seen very good-hearted individuals dealing with that type of a situation, and we don't want it to turn into something like that. All right, let me take a quick look. Assalamu alaikum to everyone else who joined us. Bilal is saying, Shaykh, have you already answered or talked about mandatory ghusl before Salat? Can be done, but qada time is approaching. Oh, okay. So as far as I'm understanding the question, like, you don't have enough time to perform the mandatory ghusl because qada time is approaching. That's good. Actually, we didn't cover that. We kind of covered it when we were talking about tayammum. So basically, when someone, the same way we said that if you don't have enough time to perform wudu, then you would do tayammum, you would have to do the same thing with regards to ghusl as well, right? And that tayammum would make up basically for that ghusl. So you can pray with it the same way you were going to pray with your ghusl. So the same way you do tayammum to make up for the lack of time that you have, same way you do for example with wudu, then you do the same thing with ghusl as well. Okay, hopefully that answered your question. Muhammad Hussein is saying, is it allowed for someone to pray when one has the urge to go to the bathroom? Yes, it's allowed. It's just makruh. And as we will discuss today, inshallah, it's not just this that's makruh. There's so many detailed actions that are considered makruh. We'll actually read a hadith from, I believe it's the 8th Imam, salawatullahi alayh, in which he mentions all these details that are makruh for us to do. Either makruh or just not recommended. There's a difference between makruh and something not being recommended. There's a slight difference there. But there's a lot of different things in salat that would be, that, you know, we would say it's not recommended. This is one of them. This is one of the bigger ones, actually. I saw hadith. I don't know if I should share this hadith with you guys because I don't want to scare anybody. But hadith says that someone who goes, you know, when they have to use the bathroom and they stand, you know, to pray, it's like they're standing there with like an intoxicant in their hands, right? So again, it's not haram, but it's better not to do that, obviously, for multiple and obvious reasons, because you can't focus, obviously, in that situation. All right, so let's move on to salat itself. Okay, let's start from here. Let me just go through this real quick, although this should be pretty clear for most of us, but just in case this is new for anyone, we, of course, when we talk about salat, there are different things that are wajib in salat, and there's two different types. There are the arkan, and then there are the other wajibat in prayer. The arkan, which is the plural of rukn, is those things that if you mess up with them, even unintentionally, then your salat is going to become batil. So I'm just going to mention this because going back to these arkan is going to be very important. And if someone knows these arkan, then a lot of times the other questions that come up for them in when they're dealing with different situations in salat, you actually would be able to figure it out on your own whether your salat is okay or not okay. Because what we're saying is, unintentionally, if you mess up with anything else in salat, then your salat is fine, right? So to know what these arkan are exactly, then you will be able to deduce, basically, with this principle, when your salat is okay and when your salat is not okay. That way you probably wouldn't have to get in touch with the Shaykh so much if you don't like to do that. So what are these arkan anyways? Number one is niyat. We'll talk about niyat in just a second. Number two is takbiratul ihram, the first takbir that we say. We'll talk about that. Number three is 2 qiyams out of the 4 qiyams that are wajib in our prayer. One is the qiyam during takbiratul ihram, that's a rukn, and the other one is a qiyam after, right before ruku, going to ruku. So basically after hamd and surah, before you go to ruku, that's another qiyam. That's the third one that is a rukn, and then obviously you have ruku and the 2 sajdas together. So 2 sajdas together is 1 rukn. So if you miss 2 sajdas in one prayer, in one rakat, or in one prayer, your salat will become batil. So these are the 5 rukns of your salat. So if you, like I said, if you unintentionally change up things with regards to other parts of salat, if you forget to say your dhikr, if you say your dhikr but it was wrong, and I'm speaking all of this unintentionally, I don't know, whatever else you did unintentionally is not going to, whatever else you skipped from the wajibat of prayer unintentionally, it's not going to create a problem with regards to your salat. Okay, let me take a quick look and see if we have any questions, or we should continue, inshallah. Okay, no questions, we'll continue, inshallah. So let's start from here, from niyat. What does niyat mean? Unfortunately, I don't know why. Growing up, and I was the victim of this myself. Growing up, we were taught that niyat is something that's really, really like sensitive. Like, make sure you say the right, I'm doing this wajib qurbatan ilallah, you know, all this stuff. And it's not really there so much in our literature. That niyat basically just means you know what you're doing, right? Someone taps you on the shoulder and says, what are you doing? You say, I'm doing dhuhr, right? You do have to know which prayer you're praying, but that's just about it. So yeah, that's with regards to niyat. Niyat is just knowing what it is that I have to do. So I don't have to verbalize it. I don't have to have it pass through my mind. I don't have to go through the sentence. I don't have to do any of those things, technically. I just want to answer one question here with regards to niyat, and that is this. Sometimes we pray. Obviously, you're praying for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're praying with the right intentions. However, there's another reason as well that that is combined with this idea of coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, you're praying but you want to teach someone how to pray, right? Or you're praying and you want to show your children, for example, that it's really important to pray. So when it's time for prayer, you go and pray on time, for example, or you go and pray in front of them, right? All of these different situations where, other than the fact that you're praying for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's some other motivation and some other motive, I should say, with regards to your salat. What is the ruling there? Ayatollah Sistani says, if that other motive, you can connect it to God in one way or another, right? Then it's okay. If not, then it would be a problem. So, for example, I say, I'm going to pray, but I'm going to pray in front of them. Why? Because I want them to come closer to religion. Okay, that's fine. So we don't have to obsess over that too much. Yes, if it's an intention where you say, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to pray here because I want these guys to like me, well, then obviously that's a problem. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. We're going to move on from that. We're going to move on to takbir. Okay. So one thing I have to mention about takbir, and we'll have a pretty, I don't want to say long discussion, but we'll have a lot to cover with regards to the meaning of takbir and what it means to say takbiratul ihram. But first thing I need to mention, and this is because there's a very common misconception, is that the takbirs that we say in our salat, not all of them are wajib. In fact, most of them are not wajib. Only takbiratul ihram is wajib. The takbir we say coming and going to ruku and sajda, none of that is wajib. It's recommended, it's great to say them. And we will mention why those takbirs are there. What's the philosophy of those takbirs that are in salat? We'll mention that in just a second. But none of those are in fact wajib. Okay. The only one that's wajib is the first one. Before saying takbir, there is a very beautiful one line or two lines of dua that has been, Ayatollah Sistani says you can say it raja'an, which means that it's not 100%, he's not 100% sure it's actually mustahab, but you can just say it because it's like you're speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's a very nice line. Let me see if I can actually just copy paste this in the comment section so you guys can see it. Yes, let's try this. Okay, great. So I just copy pasted in the comments section. It's a very beautiful dua. It says, Ya Muhsin, qad ataka al-musi. The one who does good. You're calling out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or calling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قَدْ أَتَاكَ الْمُسِيء. The wrongdoer has come to you. وَقَدْ أَمَرْتَ الْمُحْسِنَ أَنْ يَتَجَاوَزَ عَنِ الْمُسِيء. And you have commanded the good people to do tajawuz. Tajawuz means to forgive and have mercy on anil musi, on those who are wrongdoers. Wa anta al muhsin wa ana al musi. Like in this context, you are muhsin and I'm musi. فبحق محمد وآل محمد صل على محمد صل على محمد وآل محمد. So because this is the situation we're dealing with, you're sending salawats on the Prophet salawatullahi alayhi. وتجاوز عن قبيح ما تعلم مني. And forgive me for those bad things that you know that I have done. This is good to be recited before Takbiratul Ihram is mentioned. Sometimes you pay attention, Imams will be saying a certain dua before they start. Okay. Sister Fozia is asking, if there's a dog in the house and someone touches it, do they need to shower before the salat or just wash your hands and do wudu? If the dog is dry, you don't have to do anything. If it's wet, then you just wash your hands. So no need for showering. And you can't have his hair or anything like that on your clothing. So hopefully that answered the question. Salam alaikum to everyone else who's joined us. I see you guys sending salam. So salam alaikum to everyone. Muhammad Hussein is asking, is it mustahab to separate the prayers instead of combining them? So we have discussed this, Muhammad Hussein, before when we were talking about the timings of prayer. Basically, what's important is to make sure that you are doing your salats in the prime time, I think was the name we gave to it, right? And what are the prime times of performing your salat? That's something that we discussed when we were discussing the timings of prayer. So if you go back on the Facebook page and just go back into the archive, which is also, by the way, on YouTube now, and you guys can just watch it off of YouTube. that there we discuss what those things are. So basically, to answer your question, separating the prayers, if they're still separating or combining, is not what matters necessarily. What matters is whether you're praying your time in the waqt fadilat. That's what matters. Between Maghrib and Isha, yes, there should be a little bit of a gap. It's mustahab for there to be a little bit of gap. And that's why there usually is a little bit of a gap. If you pray, I don't know if you've seen in the shrines or other places, they usually place a gap between those two. So hopefully that answered that question. All right. So let's move on. So I'm going to say takbir. We mentioned that the only takbir that is wajib in a prayer is the first one. And obviously you have to say it with the proper Arabic pronunciation. One ruling before I move on to the meaning of takbir and why you even say takbir at the beginning of salat. Why not start salat with like something else? Do we have anything in our literature that tells us why it is that we start with takbir? I do want to cover this one point, that if I am praying and all of a sudden I have a doubt, did I even say takbir? Right? That sometimes happens. It all depends on this. Did you start with your hamd and your surah? If you started, then you disregard the doubt. If not, then you will say your takbir. If you find out that you said 2 takbirs, then at least according to Ayatollah Khamenei, your salat would become batil, and I believe so also from the perspective of Ayatollah Sistani. But that's if you find out later on that you had already said takbir. Okay, so why do you say takbir when we are starting the salat? So basically takbir, the whole idea of takbir is to prepare you for your salat. Okay, so it's preparing you to speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to begin this conversation, right? So hadith says, the 6th Imam salawatullahi alayhi says, that when you say takbir, obviously takbir means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. It means he's the greatest. He says when you say this, that's supposed to make everything else smaller in your perspective, so that now you can focus on the biggest thing, right? That's why he says that takbir is the beginning of namaz. All right. Now, when you go to the other ahadith that we have, you find that for one thing, this whole idea of salat, we know that it was given to the Prophet, during his mi'raj, and that he performed this salat in his ascension towards the heavens, right? And the hadith says that angels prayed with him, and these details, many of them are coming from the mi'raj that the Prophet had. So in the takbir that we say, there are a couple things that are actually mustahab. First thing is to take the hands all the way to the ears. They say you say Allahu Akbar, and then once you're done with the end of that second word, then you put your hands down, and that's mustahab. And they say your fingers should be touching each other like this. There shouldn't be a gap between them. But the interesting thing is that some of our scholars have mentioned that when you take your hands and you throw your hands back like this towards your ear, for example, they say that that is a form of you saying that I'm throwing everything that has to do with this world behind my ears or behind my back, basically, which means I'm only focusing on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at this point. So this movement of the hands is actually mustahab. It's not wajib, contrary to what many people think or believe. It's not wajib, it's just mustahab. But that's one of the reasons that they say that that's a symbol of putting everything else behind you, basically. And then they say that when the Prophet was in Mi'raj, every step that he wanted to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there was what the hadith will call this hijab in the sense of a barrier or a curtain. And every time the Prophet would come to one of these barriers or curtains, he would say Allahu Akbar, and this curtain would be removed. So it's actually mustahab to say takbiratul ihram 7 times. And if you pay attention again, many of the scholars, when they pray, usually they say Allahu Akbar quietly 6 times, and then the last time is when you hear them saying Allahu Akbar loudly, out loud, basically. So they say that this has to do with the Prophet's ascension. And then in another hadith, this hadith is from Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, famous companion of the Imams. He says that I was with Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullahi alayhi one day, and the Imam saw someone who was praying. It's a very beautiful hadith. He says, I saw someone who was praying, or the Imam saw someone who was praying, and he asked him, the Imam asked him, he said, do you know what the ta'wil of your prayer is? Like, what is the meaning of ta'wil? Long discussion, but he basically said, like, do you know the philosophy behind the actions in Salat? He said, I don't know. Is there like, it's just to worship God, you know? Is there anything else that there is to it? And he said, yes, of course. And the Imam swore by the Prophet that yes, there's no act of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed for us or for his Prophet, is what the hadith says, unless there is some sort of philosophy behind every single action that we are carrying out. Now, many of them we may not know, or some of them we may not know, but the philosophy and the secrets, of course, are there. And I want to make a small parenthesis here, real quick, before I continue. That a lot of times, I just point out this point real quick and move on, inshallah. One of the things that actually promotes being a good servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a lot of times, is not knowing these philosophies and these secrets. Because it's a whole different ball game when God says do this and you don't even know why you're doing it. You're just doing it because he said do this. Right? Like, I feel like the reason the philosophies that are mentioned and the reasoning and the symbols that are mentioned in our hadith and in our literature, I feel like it's just enough, just the right amount to make sure that we don't lose our faith, and we really feel like there is a philosophy behind each and every one of them. But at the same time, it completely makes sense for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to only give us a little bit. Why? Because when you don't know necessarily the philosophy or the reasoning behind a lot of these rulings or a lot of these movements, you do them simply out of simple ubudiyya and simply being a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Like, I don't know if I've used this example before, of where parents ask you to do something. Sometimes they ask you to do something and they don't provide any proof for it. And that's where your loyalty or your respect for them really starts to show itself. Whether you really respect their thoughts, and whether, I'm talking about detailed stuff, not major decisions that you would go by, whatever it is that they would mention. So small things. Sometimes they ask you to do something and you just do it just because it's them that's asking you to do it. So just to remember that, right? But anyways, some of them we do have. So this guy, he was with Amir al-Mu'mineen. Jabir ibn Abdullah was with Amir al-Mu'mineen, and the Imam asked him, do you know the reasoning behind these? He said, is there a reasoning? The Imam said, yes, of course. Everything that the Prophet used to do, there's a reasoning behind it. And then the Prophet starts to, Imam Ali starts to explain this to this individual. He asks the Imam, please teach me. He starts to explain this. He says, okay, listen, when you do Takbiratul Ihram, you do Takbiratul Ihram 7 times. Each one of these times, you're trying to say God is greater than a certain thing. God is greater than a certain attribute, for example. Okay? So he says, okay, so what is it? He says, well, the first time you say Takbir, what you are remembering is that God is not one to sit or to get up, for example. He's greater than to be described as something who's standing or sitting. And then he says the second time you say Takbir, you are saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater than to be described as stationary and motionless or in movement. Like, none of this applies to him, basically, is what the Imam is saying. He's greater than for you to ascribe these types of things to him, because these are for limited beings, right? It says the third one, when you mention the third takbir, you're saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater than being anything that has matter, than being jism, right? And being anything materialistic, basically. He says the fourth time you say takbir, you are saying he's greater than any type of sickness or illness finding its way into his existence. Number 5 is that you are saying that he is perfect. Nothing can do hulul in him. Hulul means when something infiltrates something else. Nothing will do hulul in him, and he will not do hulul in anything. Basically, what the Christian understanding is when it comes to the existence of Isa alayhi salam, the idea of him being God and human at the same time. That's hulul, basically. That's the fifth one. He says the sixth one, you are saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater than for me to ascribe any type of change to him, like going from one state to another state. And he says the fifth one is that you are describing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be greater than for you to say he can be understood or sensed with our five senses. And this person, and then the hadith actually continues, and it moves on into what is the secret behind ruku and sajda, and inshallah we'll continue to cover those once we get to each part of those as we move on with the topic of salat, inshallah. Just take a quick question. There's a couple one or two more hadith that I want to read, but let me just make sure. Okay, yes. Muhammad Ali is asking, can one do wudu with bits of food / gum in their mouth? Yes, we mentioned this last week, that as long as you're not playing around with them, as long as you're not chewing on them and that kind of stuff, it's fine. As long as, maybe you just swallow them really quickly, that would be fine. As long as people don't say you're eating or you're like playing around with food during salat, that would be fine. It would not be recommended. Basically, anything that will take away your concentration in your salat is not recommended. And so, in that general sense, this would fall under it, basically. Okay, so that's what's mentioned regarding Takbiratul Ihram. Another interesting point that's mentioned regarding Takbiratul Ihram, and this is another one in another hadith. And this one is from, if I'm not mistaken, the 6th Imam it should be, or forgive me, the 8th Imam. He says the reason why we have 7, and these reasonings that we mentioned, none of them actually contradict one another. He says the reason why we have 7 takbirat in our salat, or before you start the salat, is because technically you also have 7 takbirat in the salat as well. So he says, you count takbiratul ihram, and then you count the takbir before ruku and the takbir after ruku and before sajda and after sajda and all that stuff. He says if you put all that together, it's 7. That's why it's recommended for you to say all 7 at the beginning of salat, so that if you forget any one of them, then your salat will still remain as a complete salat. There are different points that they've mentioned with regards to the meaning of Takbiratul Ihram. So if anyone has questions, feel free to send them in. Inshallah, we will, moving forward, we're going to try to, inshallah, have the sessions end at about 45 minutes. And we've had some feedback to keep it in that range. It'll make it a little bit more easier for people to follow along with our discussion. So I don't have any questions coming in right now. If you guys do have any questions, go ahead and send them in, because we will be ending in 5-6 minutes, inshallah. I want to move on to qiyam. So we said I don't think we'll get too much time to discuss with regards to qiyam what's been mentioned, but just to lay the foundation. Okay, so we said qiyam is, some of the qiyams that we do in salat are part of the arkan. What are the different qiyams that we have in salat? There are 4 different qiyams that we have in salat. This is important, and I'll tell you why. And that is because later on, when we talk about someone who cannot pray standing up, knowing all 4 of these qiyams really plays a big role. And you will see some people make a mistake when they are praying their namaz or their salat, basically, because they don't know all 4 of these qiyams, okay? And they don't know that each one of these is wajib in and of itself. So once we get, as we move on, inshallah, it'll become more clear what I'm talking about. So these 4 qiyams, what are they? First of all, when you're saying Takbiratul Ihram is one duty, and then standing when you're saying Takbiratul Ihram is a separate duty, and it is a rukn. Then there's the takbir before going, the qiyam before going to ruku, which basically means you need to be standing up before you go to ruku, okay? Number 3 is, of course, when you get up from ruku. And number 4 is during qira'at. When we say qira'at, that would cover the first and second rakah when you're doing hamd and surah. And it will also cover in the third and fourth rak'ah when you are doing tasbihatul arba'a. Why is it important to understand that all four of these qiyams are part of your duty? Is because when someone is not able to carry out basically when you're not able to carry out your salat in the normal way, right? Like for example, you're on a plane and you can't stand up and pray, or you're in a car, for example, and for whatever reason you can't get out of the car and pray, okay? If you can do any one of these qiyams and then go back to the sitting position and do the rest of your salat sitting, then you have to do that. So what does that mean? That means, for example, if I know that, let's say I have some sort of weakness in my knees, I'm not able to pray standing up, right? Which a lot of our elders, is something that a lot of our elders are dealing with. But if someone is an elder individual and they say, oh, I can say Takbiratul Ihram standing up and then sit down and do my qira'at, then they would have to do that, right? Every part of Salat, because it's individual duties, whatever part you can do in the normal way, you would have to get up and do it in that normal way. Yes, if someone says, no, my knees are so weak, for example, or whatever their excuse may be, my situation is such that I cannot do any of it standing up. Okay, that's fine. You can't do any of it standing up. But if you can do a part of it, like particularly when it comes to the plane, even if you want to pray while you're sitting down, you're supposed to get up and say Takbiratul Ihram and then sit down, because that part of it you can do. There's no flight attendant that's gonna I've seen people do crazy things on planes, right? Walking around when you're not supposed to walk around, opening up the bins at the top of the plane, no flight attendant is going to come to you and say, oh, don't stand up, not even for 2 seconds, right? And that's all Takbiratul Ihram takes. So understanding that each one of these is a separate duty, that's where it's going to make a big difference for us. All right, let me just take a quick look, see if we have any questions, and inshallah we'll take it from there. Okay, no questions, we'll move on. I'll discuss two more points with regard to tayammum, and then inshallah we'll bring today's session to an end. So when we're doing tayammum, qiyam, of course we should not be leaning on anything, right? And this is something that you might see people do when they want to get up for example. As far as I remember, you're not allowed to hold onto like a bench or like a couch or anything like that. You're allowed to push off the ground, but you're not allowed to push off of or get up with other things. Specifically when you're doing qiyam, you're not allowed to lean on anything. And when you're doing the adhkar, maraji have ihtiyat wajib, that you don't basically move your feet. Your feet have to be on the ground, because we do move our feet a little bit. They do say that, however, if you're not doing your qira'at, then you can move your feet, right? And they're contrary to common belief. Walking in salat will not necessarily make your salat batil. So if I'm praying, for example, and where I'm praying there's no turba, or mohr as we would say it in the Iranian community, and it's a little bit further away, technically I can stop my qiraat, walk just a couple steps, and as long as I'm always facing the qibla, and pick up the turba. So when we say your feet have to be on the ground in qiyam, we're talking about when you are not doing any type of qiraat or anything. If you stop the qiraat, then there's no problem in that regard, and you can definitely do that. All right, we'll move on inshallah to the mustahabbat of qiyam in our next session. And there's a very beautiful hadith from the 8th Imam salawatullahi alayhi, in which he talks about the different rulings, or not the different rulings, the manners basically of what you're supposed to do when you're standing in qiyam. And we'll also talk about the falsafa, or the philosophy or the secret behind qiyam itself. What does qiyam stand for? What is it a symbol of? There have been multiple points mentioned with regard to that. We'll get to that inshallah in our next session. We'll talk about more about qiyam, and from there we'll move on also to the rulings of qira'at and pronunciation, and reciting the surahs and all of that good stuff, inshallah. Okay, thank you very much for being with us today, or tonight, I should say, depending on where you're living. Shaykh Amin will be with you guys tomorrow, and he will continue his discussion. And inshallah, the flyer for the Mizan live sessions for March will be sent out soon, inshallah. The team is working on that. And like always, alhamdulillah, we are having our courses held in multiple cities. Hopefully, inshallah, in April, we'll have one in New York and other cities as well. Many of them are being finalized as I speak right now. I do see one question here from Sister Hiba, so I'll just answer this before we end. What do you do if there is no turba inside to pick up after, let's say, a kid picked yours up? Yes, I've always said this. The difference, I remember we were studying in the Hosa. I'll end on this. I was studying in the Hosa, and I remember that there was this brother who came into the musalla or wherever we used to pray, and I was sitting with some of my friends, and he was new to the school and we hadn't seen him before, and before he started praying, he picked up an extra turba and held it in his hand as the turba was in front of him, and a lot of the guys found that really surprising. We were just sitting there, and I told my friends, I said, he probably has a kid at home. They didn't believe me. We asked him afterwards, and he said, yes, I have a child at home. I have this habit of... So one thing to do is that if you have a child at home, to just have an extra turba with you. But Ayatollah Sistani says that if you cannot find anything, if there's no turba, then what you can do is stop your prayer. Not stop end your prayer, not that, but stop reciting whatever it is you're reciting, and you can take a couple steps to just see if you can find anything, if there's anything around you. However, if nothing that you could do sajda on is around, he says you can do sajda on something that's really odd, which is asphalt. He says if that's around, you do it on that. And he says if that's not there, then it doesn't matter what you do sajda on. Inshallah, when we get to sajda section, we'll discuss this, that a lot of people think that you can put your thumb. That's a common misconception. No, putting your thumb doesn't help at all. Either you find asphalt, or, according to Ayatollah Sistani, or you are going to just do your sajda on anything, basically, at that point. So that's the answer to that question. Honestly, I don't remember right now what Ayatollah Khamenei says about that. So I'll have to look that up. If you do follow Ayatollah Khamenei, please, you can send that in as a question to Mizan Institute inbox, and we'll get to that. Sister Sana is asking, can we do sajda on napkin or any tissue? Yes, we can do sajda on that. So Ayatollah Sistani has this ruling. He says that doing sajda on, basically he says it has to be from things that you can do sajda on. So if a napkin is being made of plants that we don't eat or wear, he definitely says it's okay. From what I remember, Ayatollah Sistani also adds that with regards to napkins in particular, even if they are made from cotton, that's okay. So that would be that ruling. Paper would be the same thing. If they're coming from wood, if it's made from wood, then that wouldn't be a problem. Can we do, Sister Fozia is asking, can we do a sajda on a wooden mohr? Yes, wood is absolutely fine. Although, to be honest, I'm having doubts right now. If it comes from a tree that we eat the fruit of it, I'm not 100% sure if that's allowed or not. So when we get to the sajda section, inshallah, we'll discuss that in detail. That's as far as I can remember right now. Thank you very much. Hope to see you guys soon, inshallah, in our next sessions. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.